well, so welcome Megan.
Thanks very much, David. You've introduced the talk very nicely. I'm pulling together findings from a number of studies that we've conducted over quite a period of time now. Here I'm focusing on Dalhousie Springs, and I'm going to talk about some of the findings of those various remote sensing studies and what we've learned about aspects of the ecology, function, dynamics and so on of some of the wetlands at Dalhousie. While I'm presenting, I need to mention some of the key researchers who've done this work. Ken Clark, Davina White and Carolyn Petus were key researchers in some of the studies. And this was done by our spatial sciences group at the University of Adelaide here. So Dalhousie Springs Complex is the focus of this work. This is the largest spring complex that's fed by waters of the Great Artesian Basin, right up near the Northern Territory border, far northern South Australia, surrounded by quite an arid environment. It's a very extensive area, over 50,000 hectares. People who visited Dalhousie will, oops, I think probably wise if I don't play with that. I'm more familiar with this one, sorry. People who visited Dalhousie will be perhaps familiar with a couple of the large pools that people are able to visit, the spring-fed pools that people could visit, and one that you can actually bathe in, surrounded by tea trees and reed vegetation. But this image here indicates just how extensive those springs are, and this is by no means a typical spring. A lot of them have an outflow and then tails that extend for kilometres. So the dark areas here are the outflows and the wetlands that are fed by those springs. And this photograph also references a bit of the European history of Dalhousie. It was colonised in the late, settled for pastoralism in the late 19th century, and as part of that enterprise, date palms were introduced. Water, arid environment, great idea, and as we'll see, we're now dealing with some of the legacy of that. So Dalhousie Springs lies within the Witcherra National Park that is co-managed by the traditional owners of that region. The springs have, and the springs and the wetlands have cultural and spiritual values for those people and reference their long history in the region. The area is also very important ecologically and has high conservation values, and apart from its protection in the national park, is also listed on the register of the national estate. There are a number of threats to the whole environment and to the wetlands in particular, and one Kent's talk gave us a very graphic introduction to, and that is declining pressure of the Great Artesian Basin aquifers that feed these springs and wetlands, and the reduced flow that results from that. So some of that comes from uncontrolled bores, sometimes at considerable distance, but the other threat is from proposed mining ventures, not necessarily in South Australia, again over the border, but all of those will have some impact on the groundwater. Invasive species are another threat that the managers are having to deal with, and one of those invasive species are the date palms that were introduced over 100 years ago. And it's also thought by the managers that the proportions of different wetland species are changing over time, and that's leading to changes in the habitat for some of the fish species. It's thought that perhaps the open water habitat has been reduced in recent years. Yet, the information base that we can draw on for management is very limited. Limited understanding of how these ecosystems function, how variable they are, and what their drivers are. And there's not a lot of historic data to draw on to understand their conditions in the past. And so it's against that against that background that we've been doing these remote sensing studies. We've been developing and testing and demonstrating a range of new approaches that can help understand these spring wetlands, looking at their distribution and extent, their species composition, how they vary over time, and helping us understand what some of the environmental drivers and possible impacts are. And out of that, we think that we can demonstrate some new tools that will be useful for monitoring in the future. A lot of that work has been reported in various reports, government reports. The work has been funded by the National Water Commission, South Australian Arid Lands NRM, and JUNA as part of various programs. And it's reported in these government reports, a number of journal articles, and most recently as part of the Desert Jewels project. So I'm not going to focus on the science or the remote sensing so much, but rather draw out what we've learned about the functioning of these wetlands from those studies. And the first is new understanding of how the different wetland species perform over time, their phenology. And this has come from MODIS time series, starting back in 2002, and in fact we have pushed this back to 2000, and at the time of this study up to about 2010, querying 16-day observations of MODIS, Vegetation Index, at locations where we have samples of these different dominant species. And what we see here is that the different wetland communities have quite different characteristic seasonal responses. The Phragmites, the common reed, that is perhaps the most dominant wetland vegetation species, that has very pronounced annual cycles, and they seem to correspond with the periods of high temperature, the summer high temperatures. The other main wetland species also have higher levels of greenness compared to the surrounding arid lands and the rain-fed creeks. Not so much seasonal variation, but when we drill down into this analytically, we do find some seasonal pattern, more of a winter greening in the wetland tails. And those patterns contrast quite markedly with the pulses of greening that we see in the surrounding arid vegetation and the stream rain-fed creeks. If we consider Dalhousie as a whole, here what we've done is aggregate the green response for all of the wetlands in this spring-fed catchment area. And so this is showing area of green vegetation over a particular threshold detected by the MODIS satellite over that long time period. And what we see is these very pronounced annual pulses that are largely due to the Phragmites and their summer growth, but embedded within that, the winter pulses of the other wetland species. The other thing that's pretty obvious is that there's been quite a significant, a dramatic decline in wetland area over a decade, from about 2000, years of high rainfall, down to 2009. Wetland area very much reduced over that time period and then started to pick up in 2010 and 11 in response to annual rainfall. It's obvious that annual rainfall is having an influence on the wetland extent, even though these are fed by flows from the Artesian Basin. Coming down to finer scale studies of the wetlands, we've used very high resolution satellite imagery at selected dates to do quite detailed and precise mapping of the wetland area, again using vegetation greenness. And what this illustrates is just how dynamic some of those wetlands are over quite short periods of time. So here we've compared November 1 year, November a couple of years later, and into the next year, and the colour changes in the comparison above show us increases and decreases in the vegetation growth of that particular spring and tail that's associated with it. And a lot of these changes are just changing flow paths in response to vegetation growth, but some of them, for example over here, are in response to fires in some of the wetlands, and then regeneration and growth after that. We've used that same high-resolution satellite imagery to map the wetlands associated with particular springs quite precisely, and to develop relationships between flow of those springs and the wetland area. Now, some of the flow data came from long-term monitoring records at particular selected springs, and some were flow records collected by hydrogeologists as part of this project, using some fairly backyard sort of methods, you know, plastic bucket, spade, little dams and weirs to try to capture the water for monitoring. Out of that, what we've shown is that there's a very strong linear relationship between the wetland area, as we can map it from the satellite imagery, and flow as measured by traditional methods on the ground. And because we did this for a number of time periods, we've got a range, we've got an envelope, if you like, for that relationship under different conditions. And we believe that this can provide a surrogate for these traditional on-ground flow measurements that are very difficult to obtain in this remote area, and that this can be a tool for monitoring spring flow into the future. We've expanded that work out to a couple of other spring groups and contexts as well, Freeling Springs and Hermit Hill, that are a lot further south in the basin, but a linear relationship applying there as well. So now those studies have focused on the wetlands, the vegetation that's fed by the spring water. But here we're moving to observations of the actual surface water that's detected by Landsat, and here we've used water observations from space, which is a product that's been produced by Geoscience Australia, using the entire Landsat archive over Australia and various algorithms to detect areas where surface water is apparent. In an area like this, we've got a lot of observations because there's not a lot of cloud obscuring the images, and so it's a very rich data source to work with. Ken Clark, who's here, did a lot of this work. What we're showing here is just one of the major spring groups within Dalhousie up in the north, and this is showing the annual inundation frequency as shown by those Landsat images. The percentage of clear Landsat images that show water for every pixel in the image. So scanning through the years, you can see that there's a lot of variation year to year. And interestingly, there had been concern that the open water was decreasing in recent years, but these observations suggest otherwise. What are the factors that are influencing those changes? After all, these are spring Great Artesian Basin fed, so why the annual variability? Rainfall, annual rainfall still has an important influence on these springs. So this is a relationship between annual rainfall and the inundation extent measured as hectare days for those years. And for all of the years in that archive, there's a pretty strong linear relationship, but 2 years recently, 2012 and 2013, are clearly outliers, and there's a lot more open water or greater inundation than we would expect by the historic trend. Some suggestion, discussing with the on-ground managers, that this might be a response to removal of some of the date palms flowing up water that we're now seeing further down into the tails of the wetlands. Using that same data source, here what we're seeing is the long-term monthly inundation frequency, again, percentage of the clear Landsat images, but aggregated for the different months of the year. And again, you'll see that there's a very distinct seasonal pattern. Very little open water in summer, much more during the winter months. And if we compare that with climatic data, certainly there is a relationship with rainfall, but if we compare it with temperature, monthly temperature, there's a much stronger relationship. And so what we think is the most influential factor here is evaporation of water from the springs. So during winter, lower temperatures, lower evaporation, hence more water on the surface that's being detected with these Landsat observations. And the other thing is that the Phragmites has died back, it's not transpiring as much water, and more is flowing out into the tails to be detected in these observations. So to summarise those studies, we've developed and tested some new remote sensing approaches for documenting the spring wetlands. I focused on Dalhousie here, but a lot of our work has been on other springs in the Great Artesian Basin, the Lake Eyre Basin as well. We've used a number of scales and resolutions and temporal frequencies of different sorts of imagery, and they're giving us complementary information. And out of that, we've got new understanding of the inundation dynamics, the variability of the wetlands that are fed by that water, and I think an understanding that clearly these are very variable environments, and when we embarked on the work, a lot of people were talking about baseline. Can you give us some baseline data? And certainly for me what's come out of this is that we shouldn't be talking about a baseline, we should perhaps be talking about an envelope of variability. And by understanding that envelope of variability, we can use that as a way of then detecting and alerting or being alert to impacts or perhaps responses to climate change in the future. And through this analysis, we've been able to get a better understanding of the climatic influences and the management influences on the wetlands. And we've got some new tools for monitoring. Spatially explicit and comprehensive, time series, objective and cost effective, and I think there's a lot of scope for using these in the future. Just to finish, I've drawn on past studies, but we're continuing our work in the area. At present, we have an honours student, Alexis Burrett, not sure if he's here, who's embarking on an honours project, and he's going to be evaluating a number of remote sensing approaches for detecting and mapping the distribution of invasive palms and using some other forms of remote sensing, high-resolution images, LiDAR, and some of hyperspectral imagery to try to detect those to help management efforts. So I'll conclude there. Certainly contact me if you'd like to discuss these things more. Ken, I think, is here. I saw Ken Clark's here, happy to discuss, and Alexis, the honours student, certainly would also be interested to talk about date palms. So thank you.